start, sit Blake Bortles looking like a playoff MVP. Every week, our friends at Bruno Boys Fantasy Football take a look at every NFL game on the slate and offer up their recommendations of players to start or sit, based on that week's matchups. Some picks may not agree with, or may run counter to, the rankings and other opinions expressed elsewhere on this site. As always, fantasy owners are encouraged to absorb as much information as possible to make an informed decision for their teams. Fantasy rankings: how the players stack up at each position in Week 16. Ravens WR Mike Wallace. Wallace has quietly been on a roll the last 3 weeks, having averaged 92 reception yards per game during that span. Fellow wideout Jeremy Maclin was taken out of last week's game with a knee injury, meaning Wallace might be in for a big workload. And Indy has a poor pass defense. Vikings QB Case Keenum. Keenum is coming into a big division rivalry with the head full of steam after an impressive performance last week. The Packers have allowed an average of 3 passing touchdowns per game over the last 4 weeks. Lions QB Matthew Stafford. Stafford has been chucking the ball as much as anyone in the league. This week, he gets a Bengals team that has allowed more than 250 passing yards in 6 of the last 7 games and is coming off a demoralizing loss to the Vikings. Dolphins WR Jarvis Landry. He has averaged 9 catches per game and has 2 TDs the last 2 weeks. His 8 TDs are 3 more than his previous career high. The Chiefs' defense has been among the most generous to wide receivers this season. Patriots RB Dion Lewis. Fellow running back Rex Burkhead was taken out of the Week 15 game with what looks to be a multiple-week injury, setting Lewis up for a bigger workload going forward. Lewis also faces a Bills defense that has given up the most fantasy points to running backs this season. Browns RB Duke Johnson Jr. Johnson has scored a touchdown in back-to-back weeks. He has been one of the only somewhat consistent contributors for the Browns all season. This week, he gets a Bears defense that gave up 130 yards to dual-threat Giovanni Bernard in Week 14. Panthers QB Cam Newton. With security blanket Greg Olsen back and finally looking healthy, Newton was in vintage form, throwing for 4 touchdowns against the Green Bay Packers. Newton also has rushed for more than 50 yards the last 3 weeks. Saints QB Drew Brees. In Week 14 against the Falcons, Brees threw for 271 yards and 2 touchdowns and has cleared 265 yards in each of his last 3 games. He is also at home, where he has recorded 2 of his 3 games of over 300 yards this season. Broncos RB CJ Anderson. Anderson came back to life in a big way, carrying the ball a season-high 30 times for 158 yards. The Redskins have allowed 3 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. With the Denver passing attack inconsistent, riding Anderson is the best path to a win. Rams WR Robert Woods. Woods didn't miss a step last week in his return from an injury with 6 catches for 45 yards and a touchdown. He should continue to be looked at as the WR1 on the Rams with a Titans team that allowed a 100-yard game to Marquise Goodwin and gave up 381 passing yards to Jimmy Garoppolo. Chargers RB Melvin Gordon. Gordon led the Chargers last weekend in rushing and receiving yards. Austin Eckler has faded from being a major threat to Gordon's workload. The game script could also work greatly in Gordon's favor this week against the Jets offense led by the subpar Bryce Petty. Jaguars QB Blake Bortles. Bortles recently is shaping up to be a fantasy playoff MVP, 7 touchdowns in the last 3 games and more than 300 yards in 2 of the last 3. He has thrown only 1 interception in his last 5 games. With RB Leonard Fournette looking dicey to return, Bortles might be relied on heavily once again. Cowboys RB Ezekiel Elliott. Returning from suspension, he faces the Seahawks, who are coming off an embarrassing loss to the Los Angeles Rams. Todd Gurley had 180 total yards and 4 touchdowns in the game. It should be a solid welcome-back matchup for Elliott. Giants WR Sterling Shepard. Shepard last weekend caught 11 passes for 139 yards and a touchdown, The second time in his last 4 games he has had 11 catches for more than 100 yards. The Cardinals have struggled against slot receivers all season. Steelers WR Juju Smith-Schuster. He benefited from Antonio Brown's injury, totaling 114 yards last weekend, including a 69-yard catch. This week, he will be up against a Texans defense that allowed a monster 186-yard game to Jacksonville Jaguars wideout Keelan Cole. Raiders WR Michael Crabtree. Crabtree was one of the few bright spots for the Raiders in yet another disappointing performance. He had 2 touchdowns and could see an expanded role again this week with Amari Cooper still questionable. The Eagles have allowed 6 touchdowns to wideouts over the last 3 weeks. Colts RB Frank Gore. Gore wasn't able to get much going last week against the Broncos' tough run defense. The Ravens' front hasn't allowed a running back over 75 rushing yards in 7 weeks. Packers RB Jamil Williams. The Vikings have been one of the toughest run defenses in the league this season. Jamil Williams fell out of the game script last week with only 30 yards. To make matters worse, Aaron Jones outproduced Williams on fewer touches. Bengals RB Giovanni Bernard. Bernard was shut down yardage-wise last week but had a garbage-time touchdown. With Joe Mixon likely returning this week from a concussion, Bernard will likely be relegated to change of pace and pass-catching duties. Chiefs QB Alex Smith. Smith has been efficient lately but has thrown only 2 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. The Dolphins' defense has been solid recently, allowing 2 passing TDs in the last 3 weeks and not more than 233 passing yards in the last 4 weeks. Bills T. Charles Clay. The Patriots' defense have been known to take away the opposing team's biggest threat on offense. Clay led the Bills in receiving last week but could see himself shut down. Bears RB Tarik Cohen. Cohen struggled for only 17 yards last week when given a game flow situation that should have benefited his style of play. He is not getting the touches to contribute. Buccaneers T. Cameron Brate. Brate's usage has been too inconsistent, and Jameis Winston has been turning the ball over at will. The Panthers' defense has allowed only 2 tight ends to top 45 yards this season. Falcons T. Austin Hooper. Hooper has a dangerously low floor. The Saints have shut down tight ends all season, including Hooper in Week 14, when he recorded 2 catches for 23 yards. Hooper is not a recommended start in any format of fantasy this week. Redskins QB Kirk Cousins. Cousins hasn't thrown for more than 200 yards in the last 2 weeks. The Redskins' run game has all but disappeared, which has made the offense very one-dimensional. Titans RB DeMarco Murray. Murray had 63 yards against a vulnerable 49ers run defense. With Derrick Henry continuing to eat into his workload and big plays few and far between, Murray can't be trusted. Jets WR Robbie Anderson. Anderson predictably struggled mightily with Petty under center. Anderson saw plenty of targets, 12, but was able to manage only 5 catches for 40 yards. 49ers QB Jimmy Garoppolo. He's on a major hot streak, 300-plus yards in back-to-back games, but so is the Jaguars' defense. The Jaguars have given up the fewest fantasy points to QBs this season. Seahawks D. Jimmy Graham. He has totaled 1 catch for -1 yard over the last 2 games. Graham has been pretty much touchdown or bust, topping 60 yards twice. The Cowboys haven't allowed a single tight end more than 55 yards in the last 4 weeks. Cardinals RB Kerwin Williams. He has started with Adrian Peterson out of action, but he suffered a quad injury and likely will be less than 100%. Williams hasn't found the end zone yet in his last few weeks as the starter and is fighting Elijah Penny for touches. Texans RB Lamar Miller. He was held to a season-low 32 yards on 9 carries last weekend. Things won't be much better against a red-hot Steelers offense. The Texans likely will fall behind again and ditch the running game. Eagles RB LeGarrette Blount. He has been rendered useless with J.J. slowly taking over lead-back duties. Blount hasn't seen double-figure touches or topped 30 yards in a game the last 3 weeks.